Hello and welcome. My name is Catherine Emerson and I'm a lecturer in French at the National University of Ireland in Galway. What I'm going to do today is take you on a journey which I myself am only starting on. It has its jumping off point in the idea of a network, but it's already taken me into three distinct sorts of network and into a corpus which I'm afraid to say is much bigger than the one I described when I first sent in my abstract. It begins with an author, Nicole Gilles, a Parisian at the end of the 15th century, secretary to Louis XI, and a churchwarden in Saint-Paul, one of the churches in Paris that disappeared in the Revolution, one-time partner to Antoine Verrard, one of the best-known publishers and booksellers of the time, and landlord. Or rather, it begins with a chance mark by Denis Sauvage, an early editor of Gilles. Or rather, with two chance remarks that give an insight into what Sauvage thought he was looking at when he first came across Gilles' texts. I'm going to disappear now and leave you with the slides. It's probable that Gilles' text was not published during his lifetime. There is some talk of lost editions from 1492 and 1498, but these have never been located, and it's likely that they may have been editions of Guillaume de Nangis' history, published with continuations that shared a lot of text with Nicole Gilles' history. Indeed, Gilles owned a manuscript containing this text when he died. Sauvage, in his first edition of Gilles' text in 1549, which you can see the introduction to here, may have been the first to point out the similarity with Guillaume de Nangis' history, as he sets out the merits and demerits of the text he was re-editing for readers in the mid-16th century. As always with Sauvage, the state of the manuscript tradition was presented as an obstacle that he, the heroic editor, had to overcome. And it is true that the author's autographed manuscript is a mess, presenting erasures, additions, and second thoughts added over decades of composition. It is, however, a mess which, even in a personal manuscript, appears to be influenced by the conventions of formal book production. You can't really see it here, but it contains rubrics, paragraphs, and running heads. Exactly, by the way, what you'd expect from an author who worked with Verrard. Sauvage's two comments that set me on this road both relate to networks, one to social networks and one to textual ones. The first is the mention of the similarity between Gilles' text and that of Guillaume de Nangis. And the second is a comment that suggests that Gilles' personal manuscript was not the only one of the work that circulated. Given that a lot of Gilles' text seems to be derivative, copied from other sources, I wondered to what extent these were manuscripts of the same text, circulating among a group of Gilles' friends before print publication, and to what extent they represented different but related text, incorporating sections from each other, and a similar methodology, perhaps influenced by contacts between writers and printers, but actually distinct works. There were certainly a lot of similar works circulating at the time. Kathleen Daly has written about a group of men like Gilles, royal secretaries, who were also authors of histories, Jacques Le Picard, Noël de Fribois, and Louis Le Blanc. And it's clear that their professional network was a spur to their literary activity. Conventional scholarship would analyse the textual links between the histories produced and owned by these men, and that's certainly something I want to do. But 15th century Paris is richly documented, and I can trace these men, the printers and publishers they interacted with, and the men and occasionally women who owned their books, through their legal and social interactions with each other. I can also look at the way that physical similarities of books indicate similar use and/or similar content. To this end, I have constructed three sets of data, none of which is yet complete, but all of which can throw light on the transmission of texts in Paris in the 15th and early 16th centuries. The first set is a network based on the texts and the people who own the manuscripts of them. This is a conventional bimodal graph, and the things it reveals are exactly the sort of thing that we could predict, given our knowledge of the text in question and the people involved. The graph has its limitations. Although 15th century manuscripts of 26 historical texts in French can be identified, only 17 of those texts exist in manuscripts with contemporary or near contemporary owners. And there is a bias amongst these owners to royal collections, a bias that we'll see again in other graphs. This in itself raises questions about the importance of royal courts and libraries as a point of contact between people and between texts of the period, although it's important to recognise that royal courts are over-documented, particularly in national archives that have their origins in the documentary collections of those courts. That said, contemporary historiography, and in particular Nicole Gilles' texts, also has its origins in that collection, with official documents being incorporated verbatim into Gilles' texts. And we should not forget that the initial personal connection I identified was between Gilles and other royal secretaries who produced similar histories. So it seems that the royal court was an important connection, both in their historical practice, as it provided documents they could use, and in their decision to write histories. Another thing that this particular graph tells us, which is also not very surprising, but which is gratifying to see demonstrated in graphic form, is the extent to which texts we believe to be popular appear indeed to have been so. Such is the case, and you can see here, with the Grande Chronique de France, with 79 surviving manuscripts identified from the 15th century, and 22 owners of these manuscripts, including Philippe le Bon of Burgundy, who owned 2 of them. This represents the largest single tradition in the corpus and the largest group of owners. The fact that Philippe le Bon appears as one of those owners confirms something else that we might have predicted but can now see demonstrated. Men who have a reputation as bibliophiles generally justify this reputation when we look at their ownership of 15th century Francophone histories. In most cases, because the data here is not densely linked, most nodes are only linked to one other node, and in particular most nodes linked to more than one other node are texts rather than owners. That is to say, most owners are only documented to having owned one text in the corpus. Even Charles d'Orléans, the poet Duke, only appears once in this set of data as the owner of a text which the Jonas database calls the Chronique Universelle Abrégée, but also has the more picturesque title of La Petite Chronique Très Abrégée, possibly a misnomer since most manuscripts stretch to over 100 pages, even if the format is relatively small. Philippe, on the other hand, appears as the owner of 5 different manuscripts containing 3 different texts, giving him the largest collection of any individual owner and confirming the reputation of the House of Burgundy as a centre of book production and ownership. And this is another preconception which is confirmed by this graph. There are affiliation clusters around textual ownership, that is to say, certain texts were owned and therefore presumably read by people in the same geographical or political circle. Thus, for instance, we see that of the 3 identified owners of the Miroir Historial by Noël de Fribois, 2 are associated with the court of Burgundy, Antoine, Bâtard de Bourgogne, and Adolphe de Bourgogne. And this represents a manuscript being transmitted from the library of one man to the other, so it's just one manuscript, which is currently in a private collection. The 3rd identifiable 15th century owner, Charles, Comte du Maine, had personal connections with the Burgundian court. His second wife, Isabelle de Luxembourg, belonged to a family with connections to both the Burgundian and the French court, and Charles occupied an ambiguous position with respect to the 2 courts as tensions between them grew in the second half of the 15th century. In this regard, it's interesting to see that he shared reading material with prominent Burgundians, even if the author of the text was, like Nicole Gilles, a secretary in the French court. Pursuing this connection, I'd like to see if there's anything about this text that makes it, more than other similar texts, attractive to a Burgundian readership. Of course, it could simply be a question of availability, because once a text is available in a certain environment, it can be copied and transmitted in that environment, and texts that are not available cannot be transmitted, regardless of whether or not their content might make them attractive to a certain readership. Nevertheless, looking at these connections between texts and owners can tell us something about how the texts themselves may have circulated. In this graph, I take the same identifiable owners of 15th century Francophone history manuscripts and look for their personal connections in the documentation available in the Archives Nationales and other sources. I know that those connections exist because of Nicole Gilles' connection with Antoine Verrère. They are in partnership together at one point. Documents dissolving that partnership are in the Minutier de Paris, a record of documents sworn before lawyers. The contents of Gilles' house, as revealed in the inventory taken after his wife's death, tell us that he didn't respect the terms of the dissolution of the partnership, since he was supposed to have returned all boxes of unbound books, but he clearly hadn't because they were still in his home. The two men appear together in other sworn documents too. They had colleagues in common to whom they rented land, and in some cases the ownership of one piece of land transferred from one man to another. Gilles is the owner of a 15th century history manuscript, his orthographed text of his own history, and so too is Verhaert. He owned two of the manuscripts in my corpus, a copy of Jean Chartier's history and one of Gilles Le Bouvier. This data then links the two texts via the personal connections between the men who own the texts. The graph that I'm producing is limited to first-degree connections between owners of manuscripts and their contacts, but it allows connections between those contacts. The resultant dataset is very large and cannot be complete because of the nature of the documentation which I'm using to compile it. Even the Paris notary's documents are not complete. They may contain all the documents from one month and then nothing for a subsequent month. So I may be missing important connections between people, and any new archive may throw up new connections. My aim is to continue to work on this and to refine it alongside more traditional textual analysis of the texts, with a view to seeing not only what I have textual evidence for, but also the extent to which that textual evidence is supported by social network data. For reasons of practicality, I'm limiting myself to direct contacts between manuscript owners and other individuals, or between first-degree contacts of manuscript owners and each other. Even so, the initial pool is larger than in the first case because it's sometimes possible to identify a manuscript as having been owned by a family or an institution because of a motto or coat of arms that appears on the book, without being able to identify the personal owner. Families and institutions have personal connections, which I am charting in this graph. For instance, the church at Saint-Denis, from which much of the historiography of the period emerged, had a number of connections, both positive and negative, with people and other institutions in the city of Paris, related especially to its annual Lundi Fair, which required negotiation with tradespeople, but which also attracted criminality that was dealt with through the courts. Examining legal and royal documents shows how, over a period of time, the Abbey developed a negotiating relationship with Jean de Bourbon, Grand Chambrier de France, whose grandson's wife, Jeanne, owned a copy of the Grand Chronique, while his sister-in-law, Anne, owned a copy of Guillaume de Nangis' chronicle. Jean himself is not recorded as one of the owners of French history manuscripts, but he forms a link between institutions and individuals who did. However, it's not always easy to tell who an owner is, particularly given the frequency of names such as Jean, Jeanne, and Anne. So an individual owner of a manuscript may be recognized by his or her signature or coat of arms, but further documentary work may be required to establish that any one of a number of contemporary women who used the name Jeanne de Bourbon was the actual owner of the Grand Chronique. Moreover, manuscripts often pass within families, so identifying the original Seigneur de Berry, who signed the manuscript of Guillaume de Nangis' chronicle, does not exclude the possibility that other men, maybe even ones who use the same title, may also have owned and even read the manuscript. Identifying potential connections to these owners is therefore a complex task which will require a lot of revision as I verify or discount hypotheses about the identity of the people within the documents. In a way, this will be the easiest graph to interpret, as it will be relatively dense. The number of edges will mean that an individual edge will not be so significant, as ties between groups of individuals will be repeated. However, it's also the hardest graph to construct, and can be constantly updated as I find new information about individuals and new data about their connections. It can therefore never be complete, not least because many manuscripts bear no indication currently of their ownership in the 15th century. Again, here in this graph, there is a bias towards royal households. The nature of government means that many people have legal or administrative connections with the king, and these connections tend to be recorded and the records preserved. Just as royal manuscripts are more likely to be identified, individual monarchs are more likely to have their connections with other people recorded. Already I can see in my data that there's a bias towards courts. particularly the royal court, but also the court of Orléans-Angoulême, whose library was incorporated into the French Royal Library at the accession of François d'Angoulême as François Ier. Of course, courts are an important social forum where people encounter each other, but it is difficult to know whether their significance is overestimated by the nature of the surviving records. The third graph compares the physical properties of the manuscripts themselves. Taking different texts as a basis for defining a manuscript group, we can look at the proportion of manuscripts within the group that are on paper as opposed to skin, the proportion that are illustrated, the proportion that have coloured ink, etc., etc. All of these are, of course, proxies for the cost of the manuscript, but they're not necessarily so, as some texts were rarely illustrated, regardless of the qualities of the materials used to produce them. However, looking at these variables can give insights into textual connections, as is the case with the Chronique anonyme universelle text that circulates in rolls in this period. The physical format of this text makes it the most anomalous of the texts in the corpus, while most circulate in codices that preserve a ratio of 70% height to width, which incidentally is the same proportion of modern standard paper sizes. The rolls have an average width that's nearly twice the size of that of most codices in the corpus, but an aspect ratio of only 4.5%. That is to say, they're a lot longer than they are wide. In a number of other ways, too, this text is an outlier. Surviving in 64 manuscripts, more than any other text except the Grand Chronique de France, it has more than the average number of columns, as some rolls have sections of up to 5 columns wide, even though some versions of the text that are presented in codices are presented in a single column. The striking physical dissimilarities between this text and others in the corpus point to a very different usage. However, the style of illustration can be seen in other texts, indicating a presentational influence, which may also be a sign of textual transmission or of social contact, with readers of the chronicle rolls also reading texts such as Gilles' Chronicle, which has the same roundel-style presentation of royal family trees in its printed editions. Looking at individual similarities such as this tell us some things about the text, but it's also possible to group similarities and differences as an aggregate in a distance matrix. Variables such as material, height, and even the number of surviving manuscripts can be plotted and compared to tell us about the material transmission of the manuscripts. I've done this in a number of different ways, looking at the ways that the text is dissimilar and also the ways that they're similar. What I'd like to do is find a software package that allows me to present this as a graph so that similar texts are presented as points that are closer together and more dissimilar texts are presented as points that are further apart. There may be some options available in R or in Python, but for the moment I haven't identified something that does what I want it to be able to do. This analysis is not a substitute for analysing the content of the text, but it may provide additional description which helps us understand how the texts were transmitted. For instance, if a text presents the same physical characteristics as another text, but contains no textual similarities, we might conclude that they occupy the same niche in an ecosystem which does not require two texts. If, on the other hand, there are substantial textual similarities between texts with physical similarities, this suggests that format and content were regarded as related. As I say, this is all at a very early stage, and I'm just beginning to get some results from my analysis. I'd be very interested to hear your comments, suggestions, and anything you can say to help. Thank you very much.